Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to today's presentation, Co-Designing Integrated and Equitable Supports for Newcomers and Refugees. Before we begin our presentation today, we would like to begin with an acknowledgement that Unfor is hosted at CHIO, which is located in Ottawa, Ontario. Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We also honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. My name is Yusuf Khalil, and Force Communication Specialist. I'll be hosting and moderating today's presentation with my colleague and co-host Colleen Drake, and Force Project Engagement Coordinator, who will be monitoring the Q&A box today. I am now pleased to introduce you to today's presenters. I'm going to ask that you turn on your video as I introduce you. Dr. Ibukun Abejirinde is a scientist at the Institute for Better Health, Trillium Health Partners, and an assistant professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, University of Toronto. With a background in clinical medicine and community psychology, she conducts applied research to address complex healthcare challenges, focusing on digital technology and health equity. Believing in the power of communities to transform health systems, Dr. Abejirinde collaborates with policymakers, patients and caregivers, community organizations, and interdisciplinary researchers using participatory methods with a particular focus on the health and well-being of immigrants, refugees, racialized populations, and older adults. Isabelle Choon-Kon-Yune is a research assistant at Women's Health Hospital Institute for Health System Solutions and Virtual Care. With a Master of Public Health and Honors Bachelor of Health Sciences from Western University, her interests lie in community-based and evaluation research focused on health equity. Isabelle works closely with policymakers, people with lived experience, other researchers, and community organizations to inform the development of programs and policies to improve the health and well-being of marginalized communities. Dr. Nancy Clark is an associate professor and qualitative health researcher at the University of Victoria. With a background in community mental health nursing, she conducts research in immigrant and refugee mental health with immigrant services and primary healthcare sectors across Canada. Nancy has a background in cultural psychiatry, community-based interventions, and critical qualitative health research, such as intersectionality. A particular interest in Nancy's work is healthcare and structural determinants of mental health and how mental health services and systems work to promote better health. Welcome, it's wonderful to have you all. A few housekeeping slides and we'll start the presentation. Our presenters today do not have any conflicts of interest to disclose. And today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our Unform platform. We'll share this with you as soon as it becomes available. Should there be any technical issues during this presentation, we will inform you with details for an alternate makeup session. Before we begin today's event, I would like to take a moment to introduce you to our platform features to help enhance your participation experience. Throughout today's session, we invite you to write your questions in the Q&A window. Today, we have the option of upvoting a question. We know that sometimes many of you might have similar questions, so please feel free to upvote the questions that you like. N4 is pleased to announce that select webinars are now accredited. Members of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada, Canadian College of Health Leaders, and the Canadian Psychological Association earn credits toward their maintenance of certification requirements by attending select N4 webinars. With that said, let's jump right into today's presentation, and I will pass the virtual podium over to our speakers. Thank you.
Just confirming that everyone can see the slides. Is it okay, Yusuf?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, sounds good. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Good afternoon or good morning or evening from wherever you may be joining us. As you can see by the title, my colleagues and I are here to speak today and share a little bit about our most recent project that was titled Beyond Technology, Beyond Healthcare, and share some insights and lessons learned from co-designing integrated and equitable supports for newcomers and refugees to Canada, and how we utilize intersectionality as a framework for hosting multi-stakeholder dialogues. So before we begin, we would also like to start with a land acknowledgement. So as our speakers are gathering virtually across the country, recognize that Canada is home to many Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and have been stewarded by them since time immemorial. We acknowledge that Canada is covered by over 70 treaties and other land acknowledgements, that all people will peacefully share and care for the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We are all treaty people, and we are mindful of broken covenants. We have a responsibility to make this right with the land and with each other. And so in efforts to move beyond land acknowledgements and into action, we also recognize the importance of continually unlearning and relearning. And so we want to encourage everyone to also reflect on and learn about the Indigenous history of the lands in which you live on, the names of the Indigenous communities of the regions where you live, and also what your region or your city is doing to support those Indigenous communities and how you can also support those efforts. So now moving on into our presentation, here's a little bit of an overview of what we'll be speaking about today. So I'll start and then we'll pass it on to Nancy and Ibukun. So before I get into a little bit of the project scope, I want to share a little bit of background information. And so as many of us may have remembered, during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, the Canadian health system, along with many others across the world, experienced what we would call unprecedented shifts to virtual healthcare delivery. And so while many Canadians benefited from the conveniences of digital health technologies, our previous study, along with other research that has been published, has demonstrated and highlighted that underserved groups, such as newcomers to Canada, which include refugees, refugee claimants, people with temporary or precarious status, have not benefited from the advantages or conveniences of virtual care equally. And so the experiences and expectations that many underserved groups have towards virtual care has been largely framed around the idea and concepts of health and technological factors, such as access to a sufficient technology equipment, the ability to have the digital literacy to be able to engage with digital technologies, or even the quality of interactions that they have with their healthcare providers. However, from our study, we've learned that newcomers to Canada, for newcomers to Canada, virtual care is not in itself just about the convenience or efficiency. It's really deeply tied to broader social determinants of health, is what we call them, that are intertwined within their settlement journey, and the challenges in navigating both a new life and a new system in a new country. And so this previous study that I alluded to found that newcomers' experiences of virtual care are broadly linked to complex intersecting social, systemic, and interpersonal factors such as anti-Black racism, immigration status, as well as the country of origin in which they're coming from. And so these experiences of marginalization and discrimination often contradict their pre-arrival expectations for life in Canada. So a lot of you may be asking, why does this matter? So in 2023, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenships Canada, also known as the IRCC, released the country's immigration plans with aims to welcome 500,000 new immigrants per year. And so while we know that Canada has recently announced plans to decrease the number of temporary residents, which within their definition includes international students as well as temporary foreign workers, our social systems have suspected that folks will instead come into our country seeking asylum. And so while we know that there are many digital health resources as well as services that do exist for newcomers, many of them also operate in silos, which lead to fragmented service delivery and exacerbate post-migration stressors, which may manifest in worsening or new mental health conditions and decrease overall quality of life. And so these migration inflows require systemic reorganization in health and social sectors that has implications on how we support the settlement pathways of new or future incoming newcomers to Canada. And so if they're not thoughtfully integrated into settlement health services, and not considering the factors or the individual factors that impact individual experiences, the benefits of that we think of virtual care can remain elusive, and perhaps restrict access to resources. So moving on into understanding, what we were trying to solve, or pinpoint exactly what we were trying to solve for. We engaged in informal conversations with community organizations, settlement workers, people with lived experiences from within our networks, to engage in an exercise of journey mapping to really understand the milestones and stages at which newcomers were navigating their settlement journey. And so as you can see on the screen, on the bottom left-hand corner, we mapped out from the starting point to try to understand the different migration categories in which folks were coming through to Canada. So that might have included refugees, refugee claimants, also international students, privately sponsored government refugees, and to provide a little bit of more explanation as to what that map looks like. You can also scan the QR code for your viewing. But for those who are familiar with the refugee claimant process in particular, from what we understand, there are very strict timelines in which claims need to be made, and supporting documents need to be submitted in time for their court appeal. And so based on the conversations that we had with folks, we mapped out different touch points and actors within the system that are reflected by the red and green boxes on the map, to understand the different actors within the system that newcomers interact with, starting from, for example, the immigration officer at the border or at the airport, to being directed to a shelter or finding a homeless shelter to stay in overnight, and by ways in which they found their ways to health services, either through referral networks from community organizations that they had approached, or even informal conversations that they had with folks. Some had even shared that they got information from folks in line at Tim Hortons. And so by visualizing the newcomer resettlement map pathways through this journey mapping exercise, we were able to pinpoint that there are abundance of assets and resources that exist within the system. But visually, as you can see, it also depicts the critical gaps in which individuals are able to fall through the cracks as they are passed along this continuum of different resettlement services and resources, which often can result in lack of follow-up or inability to follow through with the instructions they are given, particularly if they are within a new country or unable to speak the language and navigate those services. And so what we realized from hearing these stories is that the systemic gaps that they're exposed to at the border manifest at the bedside. And so this activity underscored the urgent need and the importance of cross-sector collaboration for more integrated and equitable supports for newcomers. So from what we heard and the exercises in which that we engaged with prior to creating this project, we understood that the settlement sector in itself was uniquely positioned as a centralized pathway for integrated services in order to provide wraparound supports that respond to the social determinants of health and their needs. However, these pathways, as described by our journey map, are largely separated between health and social services. So we saw an opportunity for interdisciplinary cross-sectoral dialogue on how theories and frameworks can be operationalized to better promote equitable virtual care services for those experiencing multiple and intersecting forms of disadvantage. So this is essentially where the Beyond Technology, Beyond Healthcare project was born, which was supported in part by funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And so our goal of this project was to bring about cross-sectoral collaboration by convening 3 multi-stakeholder dialogues to explore the ways in which we can bridge the gap between theory, practice, and policy by bringing together academics and researchers, which reflect the theory piece, primary care providers, frontline workers, social workers, which reflect the practice, along with folks from the policy sector and policymakers to share best practices and be able to learn from each other from within their disciplines on how they provide virtual care to Canadian newcomers. And so these multi-stakeholder dialogues eventually culminated into a full-day co-design workshop, which included people with lived and living experience as newcomers to be able to co-create an intersectionality-informed solution for newcomers to Canada that Ibukun will later describe in more detail. So thus far, I've kind of been talking a lot about intersectionality and some of the frameworks that we've utilized during this project. So I'll pass it on to Nancy to explain a little bit more in detail about how we utilize them and what exactly those frameworks are.
Thanks so much, Isabelle, for the introduction to the project and reminding us around how important that mapping project was. And so picking up on some of Isabelle's points, we did use intersectionality as a theoretical framework or lens or orientation to really try and understand the nuances of the multiple forms of disadvantage, but also privilege in relation to equitable health and also virtual healthcare services. And many of you might already be familiar with the term intersectionality, originally coined by Dr. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who was a legal scholar in the United States, to understand really how human beings are shaped by the interaction of different social locations. For example, migration status, gender, class, sexuality, ability, and so on. And since this time, a lot of advances have been made related to using intersectionality as an analytical lens or even as a policy-based analysis. So for example, some of you might be familiar with this graphic of intersectionality that's used by the Canadian Institute of Health Research, which operationalizes how power across multiple identities and categories intersect with micro-level systems or factors, what might be called isms, such as racism, sexism, ethnocentrism, and so on. And so at the center of this graphic, power is positioned by social identity categories, and you can see by sex and gender and how that might be intersecting to shape the marginalization or privilege of individuals. One important idea around this concept is that identity categories such as race, class, and gender are related to each other. In other words, at that micro level, we really can't understand how gender operates without understanding race and class, for example. And again, this PowerPoint this slide was taken from CIHR with Greta Bauer's work in intersectionality. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. And so important also is that disadvantage and privilege are dependent on context. And context of, when we talk about context, we're talking about systems and structures of power. So for example, top-down policies, immigration policy that Isabelle mentioned, and also some of resettlement practices. Another important idea underpinning is that, as I mentioned, that oppression, privilege are experienced simultaneously, depending on how people not only access services, but the response to our newcomers. In our project, we were particularly interested in context in terms of policy and practice related to digital health equity, but health equity in general related to newcomers. Applying this framework really allowed us to look at not just those micro level intersections, but also the meso and the macro and the multiple levels that link individual experience to these broader systems and structures of power relations. And so in this context of resettlement, we mapped, as Isabelle was referring to, the individual settlement journey across these systems and the factors that shaped health equity. Next slide, please, Isabelle. Thanks so much. And so in applying this theoretical approach of intersectionality, we argue that newcomers experience overlapping cycles of precarity related to social identity categories, but also context of resettlement and social determinants of health. And that these advantages or disadvantages are related to community level structures such as welcomingness to address newcomer isolation and belonging, for example, Other points of precarity could also include legal status and systems and processes to promote integration. Similar policies and practices related to employment, as we know, can create exploitation or a means of economic entry and sustainability. We found that labels and categories such as asylum or refugee claimant either advantage or disadvantage newcomers in terms of their access to services and supports. And these identities at that micro level, for example, gender, migration, literacy, and language, dictates a newcomer's level of precarity and who is prioritized for that support. In the following slides, we'll explore a little bit more around these cycles of precarity related to the micro meso level factors and macro conditions where potential service gaps could enhance care around health and social care for newcomers. Next slide, please, Isabelle. Thank you. So as I mentioned, at the micro level, intersectionality allows us to understand those identity categories, how they reconstitute each other. But the take-home message really is that we can't understand these categories, how they're shaped, unless we situate that within the broader context. In relation to settlement, this means we need to unpack that context at the level of practice, or what we're calling the meso and macro level factors. Next slide, please. Thanks, Isabelle. So at the level of policy, we also utilized intersectionality-based policy analysis, a framework created by Elena Hankivsky to allow us to, quote unquote, see decision-making from a top-down or downstream, as well as an upstream perspective. At the macro level, it could be argued that policy is removed from how resettlement and community-based organizations operate to support newcomers. So it's really at that meso level and contextual level that we found what we're calling the missing middle. Not to say that the middle is missing, but rather that it's often not integrated, going back to what Isabelle was talking about how these systems and services are integrated to support newcomer health, requires us to really focus on the middle. So what we're looking at in terms of intersecting access, we tend to focus on those isms, those macro level factors, without also paying attention to the middle or the meso level. The take-home message then would be to think about operationalizing intersectionality by harnessing an asset-based approach which links the meso-level factors, for example, settlement service, community-based services and resources, with both macro and micro level factors to enhance resettlement policy and health practice. Next slide, please. And I promise this is the last slide, I think, around theory. And so the findings from our project really highlight the role of the meso-level factors, as I mentioned, what we're calling the missing middle, where settlement work really addresses the social determinants of health for newcomers. And so this allows us really to operationalize not only an intersectional policy-based framework, but really bringing praxis of knowledge to action, and where people are actually doing the work for mobilizing. Our multi-stakeholder dialogues underscored that power that exists, the power that exists when people come together from the middle or the bottom up, and we should be informing best practice for meso-level policies to mitigate the inequities, thereby operationalizing intersectionality. So the meso level is a key asset and driver for equity and change by connecting both macro top-down policies with micro level bottom-up lived realities and strengthening community-driven solutions, driving sustainable and meaningful change. And so I'll close now and say, okay, enough about theory and unpacking the layers of intersectionality, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Ibukun, who'll now explain how we turn these insights into action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Such a pleasure to be here. So my role over the next 15 minutes or so is to kind of close out what we've started. Isabelle laid the groundwork on the history around this work, which started sometime in 2022, so it's been a while. And then Nancy has framed like the conceptual and theoretical frameworks around intersectionality that grounded our approach. And so you might be wondering, like, what is that connection between intersectionality, which is for some people a very heavy theoretical framework, and practical work on the ground when you're a frontline settlement worker or organization trying to drive change within an ecosystem that is constantly shifting due to policies and politics. So I'll give two examples of how we turned insights, methodological and conceptual insights, into action. One of them is from the Beyond Technology, Beyond Healthcare event. It was a 1-year funded project. And when we had multi-stakeholder dialogues over 2 months, as well as a settlement journey map that we had designed, we then had a co-design workshop. And the idea of the co-design workshop really was to bring the knowledge silos that we had identified through the multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder dialogues together into the same room to think about how can we leverage the strengths and assets at these different levels to be able to reimagine what a best-in-class experience is for a newcomer in Canada. And so we were conceptualizing a best-in-class experience based on the interviews we had conducted prior to map out the settlement journey map as a system that is efficient, that is trustworthy, that is effective, and that is respectful. And part of what the journey map helped us identify was that in general, not to over stereotype people, there were 5 main goals that newcomers and refugees had coming into Canada. 1 is to have a sense of community and connection. 2 is to be able to get employment. 3 is to feel integrated into the society. 4 is housing, and 5 is health. And this was in no particular order. And so when we brought the group together, I believe we had probably about 65 people in the room. This included people with lived or living experience who were going through their settlement journey and had their migration pathways shaped by different migration categories. So we had people who were precarious status. We had those who had come in as economic immigrants. We had, I think, one person who was an international student. We had some people who were temporary workers. We had some who were asylum claimants, and then most people in the room were settlement workers or settlement organizations, and we had 2 persons in the room who were more policy level in the sense that they work with the region of Peel or with Toronto. And so the idea was we had a couple of sessions and we used different tools where we grounded the lived realities of a persona, and I'll share a bit with you in the next slide. We named this person Mariama, and we wanted to ground our reimagination perspective of what a best-in-class experience would look like, really underpinning the intersecting identities of what we believe that individual was going through. And so the strategy was by having people with lived experience in the room, as well as service providers at the same time, we could break the knowledge silos and we could design in real time where people were giving feedback and saying, well, if you wanted to go that way to design a best-in-class experience, that could probably not work for someone like Mariama, or whichever persona we're using, because of these identities or these power structures or these ecosystem factors that shaped how she was experiencing the new country that she was in, as well as the different services that were available to her. Next slide. So Mahalia was the name of the persona I'm just going to use. We had 3 different personas, I believe, but Mahalia was one. We said, what would happen if we had a 39-year-old female who has a toddler, who has chronic diseases, speaks Amharic, is a refugee claimant, is currently on Ontario Works, who is trying to navigate the system that is efficient, is trustworthy, is effective, and respectful. As a refugee claimant, what are the challenges she's going to face trying to access healthcare? What are the needs that the system needs to provide for her, and what will be her goals and motivations throughout this experience? And so people broke out, we split people up into breakout groups, And each group had a mixture of people with lived experience, settlement service providers, organizational representatives, those who were researchers, and where we had more people, policy people, like people who work in municipalities and regional health systems. And so there was this constant conversations happening in the design session to think through for every pain point that was identified. So one, for example, she's trying to access medicine in the pharmacy, but she doesn't have IFHP. What does that mean from a policy perspective? What does that mean from a settlement service provider or settlement organization perspective? And what does that mean for the lived experience perspective? So our dialogues, the breakout rooms, the personas, the tools, the experiential pathways that we built, I'll share a bit of that in the next slide, allowed all of these knowledges and experiences come together. And in some cases, there were tensions, right? Because, for example, the pharmacy or the settlement organization could say, well, we do have a drug benefits plan, and there's an opportunity for us to provide some medication for someone for Mahalia. However, because of our funding mechanisms, we cannot provide it to someone who's on IFHP, things like that. So all of those things got surfaced through these dialogues. Another example was she missed her eye exam, and she got lost because her toddler had a cranky morning and all of that. What are the things we can build into the system to help balance the challenges that she's facing? And one of the things that came out from those conversations was, could we leverage existing community health ambassadors or peer navigators within the system to be able to address this gap? When it came to diet and exercise issues, say Mahalia is currently staying with her family in a transitional hotel. They don't have much access to exercise points or green spaces. How is she going to be able to navigate following lifestyle recommendations? And then for each pain point, the people in the group will then explain from their perspectives what this would mean. The last point was around finding housing and childcare. She needs to get a job. To get a job, she needs to be able to study English. She can't study English because the classes are only available at a specific time. And then the settlement service providers will then say, well, for some of us, we have actually started providing these services in the evenings because we recognize these different intersectional identities and how sort of the assumptions that we make when we're thinking about programs do not necessarily align with the lived experience and the perspectives of the people that we are serving. Next slide. So this slide shows you one of the tools that we use, an integrated service map. And what is valuable about a tool like this is it helps you identify not only the experiences of the individual from a temporal perspective. So what we did was we said, walk us through what you encountered from the border all the way to the service you wanted to get. So in healthcare, it was the bedside. What were the positives? What were the negative? And so by building out this tool, this integrated service map, we're able to have temporal timeline of the different milestones that the individual needs to navigate, with the system expectations of where you get what and from who, as well as their intersecting identities and the different experiences that shaped what they will do in the next step. So the identities that people are forced to embrace, navigate, or contend with throughout their migration pathway actually surface through the integrated experience map using an intersectional lens. So for example, Mahalia, who never had to worry about what language she spoke in her home country, suddenly comes into Canada, is navigating the healthcare system or the social service system, and experiences language exclusion. That exclusion creates a power dynamic that puts her automatically at a disadvantage, which then could, if not properly managed, reinforce this feeling of helplessness and lack of hope within the system. So when we sort of used intersectionality as a kind of practical tool to critique, to interrogate, and to rethink the design approaches, the services that we were planning as part of integrated or best-in-class experience for newcomers, it helped us understand how the framework actually is defined and modified by context and time, which Nancy has alluded to. One of the key components of the intersectionality-based policy analysis framework is this concept of time and space, and that identities are shaped over time and space. The challenge from a power perspective is we tend to put people as labels. And so Mahalia, who is from her home country, is a mother of two, she's married, she has a religious identity, she has an ethnic and cultural identity. A lot of identities tend to be erased as part of the settlement experience and journey. And so being aware of that erasure and how new identities that she has to contend with throughout her settlement journey as a result of the new context she's in can help us then implement or prioritize empowerment-based approaches throughout her settlement journey. Next slide. So the second example I'm going to give is from our project, Developing Integrated Service Pathways in Peel Region. This was a multi-stakeholder collaboration that involved Peel Newcomers Strategy Group, which is a local immigration partnership there, the region of Peel and Mississauga OHT. And the goal was, we had seen that there was a disconnect between service availability and service access and use, particularly by refugee claimants and asylum seekers. And so we wanted to create an interconnected system of care across the settlement journey for different categories of newcomers. And we decided to start with asylum seekers and claimants because our thinking was, if you start thinking about redesigning existing systems for the most marginalized, then you're going to lift everybody up as you go along. So what we did was we had 2 co-design sessions. We had 1 share back meeting with as many people as were able to come back. And then we had multiple working group meetings, which were mostly like the research team, as well as the settlement service organizations and the region of Peel. But what we saw was having that mixed multitude advantage, at least that's what I call it, is having different perspectives in the room at the same time, engaging around these tensions and issues that we were trying to all solve for at the macro, micro, and meso levels. Further emphasize the fact that we all had a shared vision. There was commitment across our sectors and our levels within the system to do something, but that there were knowledge action silos. So different organizations were doing different things to address the same problems. In some cases, there was redundancy. In some cases, there was just disconnect. I can't count the number of times where within our separate groups, somebody will present a case and say, this is the case of the persona X who is trying to access this service and that service. And then someone who is from the ED of the hospital will then say, well, this individual should not have this problem because we have a mechanism in our hospital that actually allows us to be able to discharge them and send them back to the shelter. Or they will say, well, we wanted to send this person back to the shelter, but unfortunately the shelter won't take them back because once you've lost your spot, I think for 24 hours or 48 hours, then it's reassigned to somebody else. And then someone from the region of Peel said, well, that's not supposed to happen. And so we were in this bigger co-design session, but we were solving for real-time issues in our small tables at the same time by bringing the different stakeholders together. And so surfacing the different value propositions helped us shape the outcome and the impact for this new integrated pathway that we're trying to design. From a methodological perspective, you could call it like a service blueprint. And so this multiple meetings and having the meetings sort of scheduled, I think it was 4 weeks, 3 weeks between each other. In retrospect, even though unintentioned, I noticed that having multiple meetings over time allowed for the power dynamics to kind of settle and for people to feel welcomed, involved, encouraged to engage. In each of the meetings, we had at least 15 people with lived experience at different phases of their journey who were able to also speak in real time to the issues that we're contending. And that helped catch the blind spots of trying to solve for. I think that was the last point I had on that slide. Next slide, please. So what were the strategies for multi-stakeholder collaboration? So using co-design and participatory methods to prioritize how we're sharing knowledge and how we're building capacity. And when I say building capacity, it was not just from the top down, it was also from the bottom up. And ensuring that people with lived experience were involved was, we created this, what I would call a transformative knowledge network through informal spaces and through this multi-stakeholder and multi-partner dialogues. Then another point was that particularly for people with lived experience, they were able to have their own identities and expertise surface beyond their migration categories. And so the language over time and the way we were approaching the sessions over time started shifting from this deficit-oriented perspective to we're trying to help them to we're trying to work together to be able to make sure that we're designing a best-in-class experience. And so there was an automated paradigm shift, recognizing that the expertise in the room was shared, and those who were system designers did not have all the answers to the questions we're trying to solve for. One of the comments that had come out in some of the meetings, preparatory and in between for the sessions, was asylum claimants is not who people are. It's what they do as they're trying to make their way in a new country. I think from the perspective, particularly from the stakeholders at the higher level of the system, at the meso and macro level, there was a sense of humility and relational accountability. And that work continues to go on because we've now established this baseline of trust. And there's a long-term commitment to be sure that what we have designed from the sessions, we're going to translate and operationalize, monitor and evaluate to the system and get feedback from the community to see how exactly it's driving the change that we want to see. So as I'm wrapping up, next slide. One of the reflections I had from a methodological and practical perspective, thinking through, well, how did intersectionality play a role when you're just having co-design sessions? Like everybody does co-design sessions. Oh, do you mean that you had people with lived experience in the room? And I actually think it's not just that. I saw intersectionality acting as a silent compass in the sense of the subconscious awareness that we were entering these spaces with a view to integrate perspectives from different knowledge dimensions, conduct multi-level analysis while co-creating, recognize that there were power disbalances in the room. It doesn't matter that different groups were in the room at the same time, but part of changing and shifting power starts with recognizing that there's a power disbalance in the first place. For different individuals and teams, it was about reflection. And that would often happen in the moment, but most times it will happen while you are not actively engaged in the co-design session. We created the time and space, and there was a lot of equity-oriented support to say the timing of when the sessions will happen needs to be inclusive. Making transportation supports available. Somebody who, one of the people with experience, or what I like to call experts by experience, was like, I have a young child, she's barely 8 months old. Will I be able to bring her the sessions? And we're like, no, we'll make space for you to be able to bring your child in, because your perspectives as a young mother who's navigating this pathway is very critical in how we redesign these pathways. So on this slide, on the one side, you see the intersectionality-based policy analysis framework, which is very macro level. And then on the other side, you see this healthcare-oriented intersectionality wheel, which is a bit of an adaptation that we've done in our team that is very micro level and surfaces the intersecting social identities that the individual, newcomer or refugee has to contend with. And we're seeing through our work, and that's part of what we're reflecting and writing on, how these two perspectives, macro and micro level, can actually be bridged by what Nancy has introduced by the missing middle, the meso level, because settlement service organizations and community-based providers actually are able to, or they already have the expertise and the networks and infrastructure for interfacing with these groups at the same time. So we're thinking through, how do we make intersectionality more of an acute tool and framework that settlement service organizations, policymakers, researchers, and even individuals can use in their day-to-day. So in wrapping up, next slide, what are our next steps? So many things have evolved from the work we've done so far, and we could speak another hour or two about the different tangents, but one of the things we wanted to spotlight is something that has just recently started off thanks to funding that we received from CIHR, is to take a very asset-oriented, empowerment-oriented approach where people with lived experience are actually guiding the narrative of what changes are being prioritized for whom and when in the settlement journey. And because we've now been able to build a critical mass around trust, numbers, and experiences, We want to bring those lived experiences together, and we're forming what is called the Reach Out Collaborative, which is a refugee-led equity and advocacy in healthcare collaborative that will be made up of about 10 to 12 people with lived experience who have gone through the asylum claimant process, the newcomer process, and to be able to feed back to the system to say, well, this is what you can do differently to get it right. I think something that is so critical is we don't necessarily have to turn the entire system upside down. We see that the assets, the resources, the knowledge already exist. The problem is that they're existing in silos. So we're hoping that this collaborative will be a network starting in Peel region that will help shape a best-in-class experience for newcomers, asylum claimants, refugees. So feel free to contact us. Next slide. You would have access to the slides and the recordings. So these are our contact emails. We have the Beyond Technology, Beyond Healthcare Projects webpage, where we're archiving the outputs, recordings, and other knowledge mobilization materials from our project. And then we'll wrap up on the next slide. One of the things that we're doing now to build community and to keep the conversation going forward is we're building a community of practice, or a community collective. And so if you scan this QR code, you'll have access to our newsletter. And then through our newsletter, you'll be able to keep updated with the project development, events, and even also spotlighting the different work that settlement service organizations are doing. So on behalf of myself, Nancy, and Isabelle, and the rest of the project team, some of whom are also attending this webinar, thank you very much for having us. Thank you for listening to us, and we look forward to your questions. Over to you, Yusuf.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ibukun, Nancy, and Isabelle, for a very insightful presentation. We've received some great questions from our audience, so let's move on to the Q&A session. For the first question, someone is asking how do you do this work considering the difficult time with limited funding and staff resources? Do you have any further suggestions for implementation that could work in other provinces?
Nancy, do you want to take that question? Shall I take it?
I'll attempt to. I think it's a really great question, and I think we're still learning, but I think one of the key findings here is the integration and the relationship that settlement service providers have. So taking that asset-based approach and thinking about what is a best-in-class experience or what is best integrated care really revolves around the settlement connections and addressing some of the barriers that settlement has across these different systems. So that's just my first overall response. Go ahead, Ibukun.
Yeah, I think that I will add to that one of the ways we were able to do this was because we had multiple partners in the room, we were able to crowdsource resources. So for example, the refreshments and catering were handled by one partner. Another partner was in charge of the gift cards for reimbursement. Somebody else was in charge of figuring out transportation for people from the shelters who were going to arrive. Another group was responsible for the pre-session. There was a lot of behind the scenes pre-session orientation where we did like question and answer sessions. What's going to happen during this co-design session? What should we expect? Will we be able to speak? Will there be credit given for the work that we do in all of this? Is there a chance that as a person with lived experience, when I'm engaging in these co-design sessions, it's going to affect my refugee claimant hearing? And so everybody had a shared responsibility, and that way we bought time by taking almost like a divide and conquer approach. So that was very crucial because I do agree there's not enough resources and there's not enough time. But if you have a group of committed people who have different access to resources and contacts within the system, then you can move faster.
Thanks for sharing that. Another question asks, what are some key learnings that came out of your workshop to help newcomers, and how valuable is the lived experience voice to help with your services?
Isabelle, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I was just trying to find the question, so I can also answer it. I think some of the key learnings that came out of the workshop was that the expertise lies within the people who are undergoing their settlement journey pathway. And I think that while a lot of different folks have, when I'm saying different folks as in, different organizations like policy, settlement organizations, even individuals as us as researchers, we think that we have the solution and we know how to solve for the problem. And I think one of the biggest lessons that we even learned from doing our own co-design session, but then also creating one at more of a larger policy macro level, was the idea of allowing those folks to be in the room at the same time with those people to be able to challenge their notions and the assumptions that already exist on how we can solve for those solutions. And so, one of the examples of that Ibukun was mentioning earlier was having that mother there with the child. And it was like, oh, well, she's going to have to breastfeed. We need a room. And to be able to accommodate for those additional needs is in itself a priority, not only in the solution, but also how we create those solutions. So I think that was one of the biggest findings, I would say.
And one that I would just like to add is, from a critical perspective, is to change the narrative, the positioning around being the helper. There's sort of this savior complex, like we have to acknowledge. And I understand that as researchers, as organizations, as social system actors, we want to help, but there's a risk that as part of that help, we minimize that the people with lived experience who are going through it are experts. Like, people come into the country with with professional identities, with ethnic identities, with historical, cultural identities. For us, let me speak for myself. One of my biggest things was many of those who were lived experience experts in the room had self-organized and prepared for the meeting before the meeting. And so they came ready with solutions, with questions, with opportunities, with insights. They had already built an informal network of support for themselves. So I think it's about moving from how are we helping them to how can we partner and expand this partnership table for problem solving in order to be able to better improve the system. That's the other thing I'll add.
Another question here asks, how long did the co-design session last? Did you follow the traditional model of co-design, or did you adapt it on your own?
You go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, the co-design sessions, so all of them really differed in timing. So the one that we had amongst ourselves was a whole day, but we did accommodate for the fact that, folks have work, they have their daily, their responsibilities within their daily lives. And so that was a learning that we took into the next co-design session that we had partnered with PNSG, the Peel region, as well as the Mississauga Ontario Health team, in which we had done half a day in the morning, but also in terms of how we wanted to engage folks within the shareback sessions. We ensured that they were during times or different times or have different opportunities to engage either in the evening or the morning to be able to allow folks to participate when they were able to. In terms of following the traditional model of co-design, maybe Ibukun can speak to that.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what we mean by the traditional model of co-design. So I can't speak to was it traditional or not. I think what I will say was different is that we've done co-design in other spaces with other groups in other sectors. We co-designed for the specific group and for the specific need, and we were iterating in real time. So like during the co-design session, something will surface that we're like, we didn't plan for this. We will pivot and shift with the group as opposed to staying to the template we had prepared. So there was a lot of preparation that happened behind the scenes, so people are not coming and starting from a blank slate. But once things started emerging and we noticed that the direction of conversation or the focus of the group was shifting, then we will just follow along as opposed to staying rooted in what we had intended to do. I'm not sure if that answered that question.
Yeah. Continuing on the theme of that session, one person is asking, how is the collaboration and learnings being fostered since that event?
I think I can answer that one. So 3 things going on. Well, more than 3, but I can remember 3 very clearly. So the outputs of the session, we've been having, I'd probably say weekly or bi-weekly meetings in smaller groups, because now we're moving from all of the output, prioritization, because you cannot boil the ocean, And then we're operationalizing the new model for integrated access to care that has now come out of those sessions. So that's one thing that is going on. Again, because you have all the stakeholders in the room, the settlement organizations don't feel that they're doing it alone. The OHT doesn't feel that they're doing it alone. The local immigration partnership doesn't feel that they're doing it alone. So I think it allows us strengthen the funding mechanisms, and stay true to our organizational mandate by working together to operationalize. Because part of what we're thinking through this prioritization is who can already do what, or who is even already doing what, and then we distribute the load and we can move forward. Because part of the accountability, I remember in one of the meetings, was you're going to do something about this. You're bringing us together to co-create something. When are we going to see this change that we're implementing? So that's one thing. The other thing that we're doing to keep the conversations going is the community of practice, which you can join. We have a monthly newsletter where people are engaging and we're disseminating information. And then the third is the Reach Out Collaborative that we've just started. It's going to focus, our first project is going to focus on mental health, but the idea is to focus on the integrated best-in-class experience overall.
Thank you for that answer. And thank you again, Ibukun, Isabelle, and Nancy for taking the time to participate in today's discussion. And also many thanks to you, the audience, for joining us and engaging with us today. You're welcome to join us again for our upcoming events. Our March events are listed on the screen. If you missed any part of today's presentation or would like to watch this session again, we will post the recording on the N4 platform within the next week. We want to continue the dialogue this presentation has started. We will be moving all the questions we did not get a chance to address today to the N4 online moderated discussion forum called Meeting Place. We have invited our presenters to respond to your questions there. We also have curated several resources related to today's presentation topic. You can find these in our resource toolkit, and we will link them when we share the on-demand version of this discussion. So if you haven't yet, please sign up to newcomernavigation.ca for all our resources and learning opportunities. And following today's session, you will be invited to complete a survey to share your feedback with N4. These surveys help us continuously improve and seek out new webinar content and opportunities that are responsive to topics that you're interested in. And finally, check out our N4 mobile app available on Apple and Android devices through the QR code here, or by going to newcomernavigation.ca/iOS or Android. Thank you again, and we hope you can join us at a future N4 event. Stay safe and well, everyone. And I'll hand it back to our speakers for any final words.
I think I'll just say, and I'll let Nancy and Isabelle speak. Thank you so much. We're seeing so many questions in the Q&A, so happy to connect Yusuf to help answer this one by one, because I think they're all important questions. And also happy for people to connect with us at any time to reach out. Thank you for this opportunity. Nancy?
Thank you.
Same. Thanks so much for the opportunity. It's a privilege to work together with Ibukun and Isabelle, and I think it's really, we wanted to highlight the strengths and the resources that that middle section already has, and how we're learning from that actually across these systems. So just highlighting that again, and thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Nancy. Isabelle, Ibukun, it was a pleasure to have you guys. And thank you everyone for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.